I want you to slow down for a moment, because the shift unfolding this week may look ordinary from the outside while creating a much deeper change within you. I have been studying this period closely, and the more I examine the pattern, the clearer it becomes that many people may completely overlook what is happening beneath the surface. Today, August 25th, Mercury leaves Leo and moves into Virgo. And while that may sound like a routine change of signs, this transition begins a much larger sequence. The important part is not simply that Mercury changes signs, but what begins to unfold around that movement. Within roughly 72 hours, a rapid succession of cosmic alignments creates a chain reaction that can alter how you process information, express yourself, make decisions, and understand what has been happening in your life. Think of it like walking into a room where several pieces of a puzzle have already been placed, except you suddenly realize they've been pointing toward the same picture all along. There are 3 particular messages within this transit window, and they appear one after another, with each development preparing you for the next. If you recognize what is happening, instead of dismissing the feelings that surface, you may reach the end of this week with a level of mental clarity that has been missing for a very long time. But if you ignore these signals, the following weeks may feel unnecessarily confusing, mentally heavy, or directionless, especially while it seems as though everyone around you knows exactly where they are going. This is especially important if your mind has recently felt unusually crowded. Perhaps you have been unable to concentrate, jumping from one thought to another, questioning choices you normally would make without hesitation, or repeatedly revisiting conversations and decisions long after they were finished. If that sounds familiar, do not assume you are simply losing momentum. There is a reason this mental pressure is appearing, and the deeper meaning becomes especially important when we reach the second message. But before that can make sense, you need to understand the condition Mercury is in right now, because the transformation actually begins before Mercury enters Virgo. Sometimes the mind becomes unsettled immediately before it becomes clear. Right now, Mercury is occupying the final degree of Leo, the 29th degree, and that position carries particular astrological significance. It is known as the analytic degree, often associated with the idea of the destroyer. The language sounds severe, but the symbolism is more revealing than frightening. The 29th degree represents the closing examination of a sign, the point where its themes become highly concentrated before the planet moves onward. It is almost as if the entire lesson of Leo has been compressed into one final moment and turned up as high as it can go. With Mercury reaching 29 degrees of Leo, questions surrounding communication, self-expression, recognition, approval, and the desire to be understood can become especially intense. You may have felt that intensity without having a clear explanation for it. Perhaps there's been something you desperately wanted to say, yet every attempt to put it into words felt incomplete. Maybe you have wanted someone to finally understand your perspective, acknowledge what you have contributed, or hear what you have kept inside for far too long. At the same time, another part of you may have been telling you to remain silent. That inner contradiction can create a peculiar kind of exhaustion, because your mind is simultaneously preparing to speak and preparing to protect itself from speaking. It can feel like pressure accumulating behind your thoughts, with no obvious place for that pressure to go. Then comes another important piece of the transition. Just hours before Mercury enters Virgo this morning, Mercury forms a direct opposition to the lunar node. This is described as a fated aspect, and within the symbolism of this moment, it points towards something that has reached the end of its usefulness. It could be an old narrative you have carried about who you are, a mental pattern that has shaped your decisions, or an expectation about how other people are supposed to perceive you. Whatever form it has taken, the message is that it cannot continue traveling with you into the next phase. This may explain why the current atmosphere feels like an uncomfortable mixture of urgency and fatigue. One part of you is ready to move, but another part understands that movement without release would only carry the old weight into a new environment. You are not simply waiting for a planet to change signs. You are standing at the edge between one mental pattern and another. Once Mercury enters Virgo today, the quality of thought begins to change dramatically. The emphasis moves away from the fiery Leo concern with visibility, recognition, and personal expression, and towards something more measured, analytical, practical, and exact. Your mind may begin noticing details that were previously hidden beneath emotional noise. Words can become more deliberate. Thoughts can become easier to organize. And the things you once struggled to explain may suddenly become much easier to name. This is where the first message begins to reveal itself. Your words are about to become medicine. Mercury enters Virgo at 7 in the morning on August the 25th. And this placement deserves your attention because Mercury in Virgo is far more significant than simply saying that Mercury has moved into a compatible sign. The real story begins with what this new mental atmosphere asks you to recognize. And that is where the next part of this journey takes us. This is the moment when Mercury reaches a position where its intellectual qualities can operate with extraordinary strength. Because Virgo is one of the signs where Mercury is both at home and elevated at the same time. There is a reason this combination stands apart in astrology. The symbolism points toward a mind that can become exceptionally exact, observant, organized, and capable of separating what matters from what does not. Thoughts that previously felt scattered can begin arranging themselves into a clearer pattern. Instead of circling around an idea, you may suddenly understand the precise point you have been trying to reach. Instead of speaking simply to release emotion, you may discover that you can choose words that actually communicate what you mean. But the part of this sequence that deserves your closest attention arrives within hours of Mercury entering Virgo, when Mercury forms a perfect trine, a harmonious flowing aspect, with Chiron in Taurus. Chiron is known as the wounded healer, and astrologically it represents the deeper injuries we carry, the experiences that may never completely disappear, but can eventually be transformed into understanding and wisdom. Now imagine what happens when Mercury, operating with such analytical strength, connects directly with that symbolic territory of old wounds. The mind receives an opportunity to translate pain into language. You may suddenly discover a sentence for something you have felt for years but could never explain properly, the disappointment you kept minimizing, the frustration you could never organize, the memory that continues replaying itself in your mind. All of it may begin taking a recognizable shape. There is tremendous power in identifying an experience accurately. When you can finally name what has been hurting you, the experience may no longer control you in quite the same invisible way. It becomes something you can observe, understand, and work with. This is not about pretending that saying something aloud magically erases pain. It is about the psychological shift that happens when confusion becomes language. I have been noticing this quality myself, where thoughts that seemed impossible to organize suddenly feel much easier to understand, almost as though a layer of interference has been removed from the mind. You may experience something similar, especially if you've spent months knowing that something was wrong without knowing how to explain exactly what it was. And there is another reason this aspect can feel especially grounded. Virgo and Taurus are both earth signs, so the symbolism does not stop at thoughts and conversations. You may become more aware of how unresolved experiences have been carried physically. The tightness in your shoulders, the tension in your jaw, the discomfort in your stomach, or the restless sensation that appears when you are trying not to process something may suddenly become more noticeable. As your mind begins sorting through what has been stored emotionally, you may become more conscious of what your body has been carrying as well. That does not mean one planetary aspect suddenly repairs every wound or resolves every problem overnight. That would be far too simplistic. What this period can represent instead is an unusually useful opening. A moment when several tools seem to become available at once. You have greater clarity to recognize the wound, greater precision to describe what happened, and greater groundedness to consider what you can actually do with that awareness. If there is a difficult conversation you have been postponing, whether it needs to happen with another person or within your own mind, this energy may help you approach it with greater honesty. It may not make the conversation comfortable, and it certainly does not guarantee an easy outcome, but it can make the truth easier to express. That is the essence of the first message, therapeutic articulation, the realization that the words you have been searching for may finally be within reach. But do not assume the clarity will remain uninterrupted, because the next stage of this sequence introduces an entirely different experience. The mental fog returns, and this time it serves a very different purpose. Remember that strange period of confusion you may have been experiencing lately, the inability to focus, the tendency to overthink, the sensation that your mind keeps searching for an answer but cannot settle on one. This is where that pattern begins to make more sense. After Mercury gives you the ability to organize your thoughts and identify what has been buried underneath them, the atmosphere changes again. On August the 27th, Mercury encounters 2 consecutive quincunxes, and the experience can feel dramatically different from the clarity that came before. During the early morning hours, Mercury forms a quincunx to Pluto. A quincunx is an uncomfortable astrological relationship, because the 2 planets involved do not naturally operate through the same language. Their elements and rhythms do not easily cooperate, creating a sense that adjustment is constantly required. When Mercury encounters Pluto in this way, the mind can become intensely focused on what lies beneath the surface. Pluto represents power and the subconscious, so thoughts may begin moving toward hidden motives, unresolved fears, psychological patterns, and questions that do not have immediate answers. You might catch yourself analyzing another person's behavior repeatedly, wondering whether there is something they are not telling you, or becoming fixated on a possibility that you cannot actually prove. The analytical ability of Mercury in Virgo can become extremely strong. But instead of directing that precision toward a useful solution, the mind may start applying it to uncertainty. It can resemble having an extraordinarily powerful searchlight, but pointing it into a dark room where every shadow begins to look significant. You may recognize the experience of your brain attaching itself to one thought and refusing to release it, even while another part of you understands that the conclusion may not be logical. Then, before you have much time to recover from that intensity, another quincunx follows. Barely 2 hours later, Mercury forms a quincunx to Neptune. Neptune represents illusion, dreams, and dissolution, and this creates a very different kind of challenge for Mercury. Virgo wants definition, order, precision, and clear information, while Neptune can make boundaries less distinct and meanings more difficult to hold on to. The result can feel like trying to grasp something that continually slips away. You may know what you want to say and then lose the sentence halfway through speaking. You may read the same paragraph repeatedly and realize the information is not truly registering. You may begin a task with confidence, only to discover that your attention has drifted somewhere completely different. This does not mean that your intelligence has disappeared. It means the mental environment has temporarily become much less cooperative. And understanding why that happens is essential, because the next part of this sequence depends on recognizing the difference between genuine intuition, psychological fear, and simple mental overload. You may notice the fog in surprisingly ordinary ways. You could type a message and send it to the wrong person, hear a simple statement and interpret it completely differently from what was intended, or walk away from a conversation wondering why you suddenly cannot tell what the other person meant. This is the kind of confusion I am talking about. And if you experience it on the 27th, I want you to remember one thing. It does not mean that you are falling apart, losing your intelligence, or somehow failing to keep yourself together. This is a temporary passage within the larger sequence, and the important question is not how quickly you can force the confusion away, but whether you can allow yourself to move through it without turning against yourself. Think of what came before as the opening of a door. The first message brought precision, recognition, and the possibility of healing through language. But the next answer is not immediately placed in your hands. Instead, you are asked to remain in the space where certainty disappears. You are asked to experience what happens when the mind cannot immediately label every feeling, explain every event, or organize every possibility into a neat conclusion. For someone who depends heavily on logic, analysis, and mental control, that can feel deeply unsettling. When you're accustomed to solving problems by thinking harder, it can be frightening to discover that thinking harder is no longer producing the relief you expect. Some experiences cannot be solved through analysis alone. Some emotions need to be experienced before they can be understood. Some questions require surrender before an answer can emerge. That is why this period of disorientation matters. The confusion is not meaningless noise. It is creating the psychological space necessary for what comes next. The darkness has a purpose because it prepares your perception for the light that follows. And that brings us directly to the second message, because this is where the entire sequence can suddenly make sense. Imagine yourself moving through August 27th with your mind unusually unsettled. Perhaps your thoughts are scattered, your confidence is temporarily shaken, and you find yourself questioning situations that normally would not bother you. You may even feel anxious because you cannot determine which interpretation is correct. Then, at 1 in the afternoon, the atmosphere changes dramatically. The Sun and Mercury meet at precisely the same point in the sky, creating a perfect conjunction in Virgo. In traditional astrology, when a planet reaches an exceptionally close position to the Sun, it can enter a condition called Kazimi, an Arabic term meaning in the heart. This distinction matters because a planet in Kazimi is not considered weakened by its closeness to the Sun. Instead, it is understood as being intensely empowered, almost as though the planet has been brought directly into the center of illumination. Now consider what that means for Mercury, the planet associated with thought, communication, perception, and understanding. Especially while Mercury is in Virgo, the sign where its capabilities are considered to operate with maximum strength. This combination creates the symbolism of an extraordinarily concentrated mental moment. I believe it can become one of the clearest periods for understanding something that has previously remained tangled or uncertain. It may feel less like gradually solving a puzzle and more like suddenly turning on a powerful light in a room that has been dark for hours. A decision you have repeatedly reconsidered may suddenly seem obvious. A situation that has kept you emotionally entangled may reveal its central truth. A question you have carried back and forth in your mind may suddenly stop feeling like a question at all. The important thing is that the clarity does not simply erase the fog. It follows the fog. That difference is profound. The uncertainty created by the earlier quincunxes may have pushed your mind to its limits, forcing you to confront how much energy you spend trying to control what cannot yet be known. Then the Kazimi arrives and gives you a radically different experience. Suddenly, what seemed impossible to understand can become remarkably simple. It can feel as though the confusion has not merely disappeared, but has been consumed by the concentrated brightness of the solar conjunction. And perhaps that is why the insight can feel so powerful. If you had received the answer without first experiencing uncertainty, you might have dismissed it as another passing thought. But after hours of questioning, doubt, and mental exhaustion, recognition can land with extraordinary force. You may not simply think you understand. You may feel an unmistakable internal certainty that tells you something has finally clicked into place. This is the deeper meaning of the second message. Truth does not always appear when everything is calm and comfortable. Sometimes it becomes unmistakable only after you have moved through the storm that prevented you from seeing it clearly. The confusion was not necessarily a mistake in the process. It created the contrast, that allows the breakthrough to become visible. So if you have been waiting for some indication of what direction to take, if you've been asking for a moment when the right choice becomes easier to recognize, pay very close attention to what enters your awareness on the 27th. Record the thought, the realization, or the sudden understanding that arrives, because the timing may be more meaningful than it first appears. But the sequence does not end with that illumination. In fact, the clarity is followed by something that can disturb the entire emotional landscape again. And this is where the story becomes much more intense. Just hours after the Kazimi brings that concentrated moment of insight, another major event arrives. At 12:14 in the morning, UTC on August 28th, there is a lunar eclipse in Pisces, a full moon eclipse positioned directly opposite the concentration of Virgo energy that has been building. Eclipses deserve particular attention because they are not simply ordinary full moons with stronger emotions attached to them. In astrology, they are often treated as accelerators of fate, periods when developments can move faster, endings can arrive with less warning, and subjects that have remained buried for months or even years can suddenly demand attention. This particular eclipse activates the Virgo-Pisces axis, creating a polarity that can be psychologically intense because it places two very different approaches to life directly across from each other. Virgo seeks order, precision, analysis, and practical understanding, while Pisces represents a more fluid world of emotion, intuition, surrender, and experiences that cannot always be reduced to clear categories. After everything Mercury has just taken you through, this opposition becomes especially significant. You have been asked to sharpen your thinking, confront uncertainty, receive clarity, and now you are being brought into an eclipse that challenges the balance between knowing and surrendering. The next stage is where those opposing forces begin to collide, and that is the shockwave most people may not be prepared to experience. The tension becomes much clearer when you place the two sides of this eclipse directly across from each other. Virgo represents structure, discernment, logic, precision, and the desire to understand what is happening so that you can manage it. Pisces moves in another direction entirely, towards surrender, emotion, intuition, faith, and the willingness to accept that some experiences cannot be controlled simply by thinking about them harder. This is why the eclipse can feel so personal. The clarity you just received through the Kazimi does not disappear, but it is immediately challenged by a deeper emotional question. You may have finally understood something intellectually, only to discover that your heart has not caught up with your mind. You may know exactly what happened in a situation and still feel unsettled by it. You may understand why a relationship ended, why a decision was necessary, or why a particular pattern keeps repeating, yet still carry an emotional response that cannot be organized into a neat explanation. That distinction matters. Understanding an experience intellectually does not automatically mean that you have emotionally processed it. Knowing the reason for your pain does not necessarily mean the pain has finished moving through you. This Pisces eclipse can expose that gap. For many people, analysis becomes a form of protection. If we can explain an emotion, categorize it, identify its cause, and find a logical solution, we may convince ourselves that the emotional work is complete. But the deeper truth is that some things are not asking to be solved. They are asking to be felt and released. That is why you may experience an unexpected emotional wave around this eclipse. You could suddenly cry without being able to identify one specific reason. An old memory may return with surprising intensity. A dream may feel unusually vivid or emotionally charged. You may find yourself carrying a feeling that seems disconnected from whatever is happening in the present moment. Do not automatically interpret that as weakness or instability. Within the symbolism of this eclipse, it can represent emotional material finally rising high enough to be acknowledged. Think of it as clearing a room that has been crowded for years. The clarity you received earlier cannot fully settle into your life if your emotional world is still filled with everything you never allowed yourself to process. The eclipse brings some of that hidden material toward the surface, so it can move rather than remain buried. And then the sequence takes another dramatic turn. Only 3 hours after the eclipse reaches its peak, Mercury forms an exact square to Uranus in Taurus. This is where the atmosphere becomes electric. A square creates friction and pressure, and Uranus is associated with sudden disruption, unexpected developments, breakthroughs, and changes in the way we understand reality. After the emotional release of the eclipse, this aspect can feel like a sudden jolt through the entire system. Something you considered settled may suddenly require reconsideration. A plan could change without warning. A conversation might move in a direction you never anticipated. Information could emerge that forces you to reinterpret a situation you thought you already understood. The first reaction may be discomfort, because people naturally prefer certainty after working so hard to achieve it. But this is precisely why the sequence matters. First, Mercury gives you the ability to identify the truth. Then the eclipse brings you into contact with the emotional reality surrounding that truth. Then Uranus arrives and disrupts the structures that would otherwise allow you to return comfortably to your previous habits. In that sense, this square is not simply meaningless instability. It functions symbolically like an electrical shock that wakes the system back up. The purpose is not destruction for its own sake. The purpose is to prevent a new realization from becoming another thought that you acknowledge today and forget tomorrow. If your old mental framework can no longer contain what you have recognized, something has to change. Your assumptions may need to change. Your plans may need to change. Your response may need to change. Perhaps even your opinion about something you once considered completely settled will need to evolve. That can be frightening, because adaptation requires admitting that the version of reality you were comfortable with may no longer be sufficient. Yet this is the third message of the sequence: radical adaptation. Seeing the truth is only the beginning. Feeling the truth takes you deeper. But allowing that truth to influence your behavior is where transformation actually becomes visible. You may have to adjust a plan, reconsider a direction, change your expectations, or release an idea that once seemed essential to your identity. That does not mean everything familiar must be destroyed. It means you become willing to stop protecting structures that no longer support who you are becoming. The experiences that transform us rarely arrive in a perfectly comfortable package. They often appear through disruption, uncertainty, emotional intensity, or sudden changes that force us to become more flexible than we plan to be. And when the initial shock passes, you may look back and realize that the ground beneath you has changed because your understanding has changed. That is why this entire period deserves more attention than it might receive at first glance. From August 25th through August 28th, you are moving through a roughly 72-hour sequence that can be understood as a complete cycle of mental and emotional reorganization. First comes the opportunity to use language as a form of healing, giving names to experiences that have remained difficult to explain, and bringing order to parts of your inner world that have felt chaotic. Then comes the fog, a period where certainty becomes less reliable, and the mind is forced to recognize that not every question can be answered immediately. From that uncertainty comes the concentrated clarity of the Kazimi, a moment when something that seemed complicated may suddenly become simple enough to understand. Then the lunar eclipse in Pisces brings emotion into that understanding, reminding you that intellectual recognition and emotional processing are not identical. Finally, the Mercury square Uranus introduces the disruption necessary to prevent you from simply returning to the same patterns with your new awareness safely stored away. The sequence keeps asking the same deeper question in different forms. What will you do with what you now know? This is why I see this period as more than a collection of astrological events. The symbolism points toward a fundamental change in perception. The universe is not merely offering information, it is challenging the way you process information, the way you respond to emotion, and the way you decide what deserves to remain part of your life. The deeper transformation may therefore have very little to do with external circumstances at first. It may happen inside the way you interpret yourself. You may begin recognizing patterns you previously overlooked. You may see wounds that influence choices without your awareness. You may identify stories about yourself that once protected you but no longer describe who you are. You may discover potential that was hidden beneath years of doubt or mental noise. In that sense, this transit becomes a mirror, not a flattering mirror and not a cruel one, but an unusually precise one. It reflects what is actually there. What you choose to do after seeing it remains yours. If you are watching this now and have stayed through this entire sequence, perhaps the most useful response is not to search desperately for one dramatic prediction. Instead, become observant over the next several days. Notice what becomes easier to say. Notice which thoughts become difficult to ignore. When the fog appears, resist the urge to panic or immediately assume something is wrong with you. When the Kazimi brings clarity, record the realization rather than allowing it to disappear into the rest of your day. If something suddenly makes sense, give that insight enough attention to determine what it is asking of you. And when the shock wave arrives, do not automatically fight every change simply because it disrupts your expectations. Some structures may need to move. Some assumptions may need to break apart. Some plans may need to be rewritten because your understanding has become more accurate. What emerges from that process may be a version of you that feels more deliberate, more honest, and more capable of moving with purpose. Not because the outside world suddenly became perfect, but because your relationship with your own mind became clearer. And perhaps that is the most important message underneath all three stages. Clarity is not simply the ability to understand what is happening around you. It is the courage to recognize what is happening within you and then respond accordingly. If this period feels unusually personal, take that feeling seriously. The timing may be meaningful to you precisely because you are ready to notice something that you were previously unable to see. Over the coming days, watch the fog without fearing it. Recognize the clarity when it arrives, and allow the unexpected developments to show you what needs to evolve. If this message resonates with what you have been experiencing, share your experience and let others know what the fog, the clarity, and the pressure have felt like for you. There can be something deeply reassuring in discovering that you are not the only person moving through an intense period of uncertainty and recognition. Take care of yourself through this transition. Remain observant and allow the next stage to reveal itself without forcing it before its time. The story continues from here, and the next chapter begins with what you choose to do with everything you have just seen.